Hello, and welcome to the Kemetic How-To Guide. I'm your host, Sharon, and welcome to our 11th season. This past fall, I picked up this copy of the Book of the Dead, specifically the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Book of Going Forth by Day. And it has a series of authors, starting with Dr. Ogden Gullett Jr., including Dr. Raymond O. Faulkner, Carol A.R. Andrews, J. Daniel Gunther, and James Wasserman. This was a collaborative effort, and for me this was a random purchase that I'm so glad I made. I really recommend this if you can get it. And I mentioned as such in our video on reconstructing ancient altars. It's large format, and it has a lot of color reproductions in it, and those are important. Let me explain why. And actually, it's in the foreword and the introduction. There's a lot of great things in here that I didn't know, and it's worth reading that. And there's even more information in the back. It's really, like I said, you need to get this book. One of the things that you learn in here is that for the ancient Egyptians, images were just as important as text, especially in the Book of the Dead. And what we call chapters in the Book of the Dead, the word that they used at the beginning, row, that could be also translated as a spell or recitation, something spoken, but the text was equally important with the images. And that's one of the reasons why this thing has the format it does, because everything that's in here, this is all the text that goes with these images, and they keep the translation right underneath of it, so that you understand the meaning of the whole thing. Because what's interesting is that by the late period, they were creating copies of Books of the Dead that had very carefully illustrated vignettes, as they call them, but the text that went with them was very brief. Sometimes it left off in the middle of a word. So obviously, they felt like just the essence of it was enough. Or you might have had an artist or scribe who didn't really understand the words to read them, but they were just copying them, and okay, this looks right, and so they can tell that they made little mistakes. But as long as they had the pictures, for a lot of Egyptians, they thought, hey, that's okay. Now, some of that might have been because people commissioning it may not have been, as well read in the religious texts. It's possible that you had someone who knew how to record, grain measurements and stuff like that, and that made them their living, but they didn't understand the arcane texts, and so, hey, as long as I've got, a general, facsimile of it, I'm good, right? So that tells us a little bit more about, how they saw these works. One thing that I've noticed as I was reading that is, hey, if you can't read Egyptian hieroglyphs now, but you're an artist, and you're really good at copying the things that you see, guess what? You're just as good as some of the folks who got paid to make the Book of the Dead back in the day. So now, this also explains how our expectations are a bit colored when we try to read something like the Book of the Dead, especially in the early days of Egyptology, because we're used to dealing with texts from a revealed religion, and there's a single book like the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, that the religion is based off of, and early scholars were trying to find something like that in the Book of the Dead. And that's why, if you see older translations, they will say the Theban recension, or they also refer to the Sate recension, because they were thinking that this was, a text that had a master copy somewhere. It didn't. It never did. And another funny thing about Egyptian religion is, if you look for a single unified story of, creation and, how things came to be, they didn't have that either. To put it in terms that a lot of us would understand now, there was no 0 hour in Egyptian mythology. So imagine all the different DC storylines, and nobody ever tries to unify any of them. That's what you had with Egyptian religion. They didn't see a need to unify everything. If these folks, say that Ptah created the world, that's okay. We might incorporate that a little bit into here, but, we think that Ra created the world. And those folks over there think Neith did it, so, it's all okay. And that's part of the reason why individual owners' copies of the Book of the Dead, when someone was buried with, a whole series of, spells from the Book of the Dead, that collection could vary. Different examples that we've found have different chapters and arrangements than others did. Someone in the Kemetic pagan community kind of described this as being like a shopping cart, and somebody would just say, well, I need a little of this and a little of that. The only caveat to that analogy is that assumes you could see the whole grocery store. The problem is that for a lot of folks, they didn't know everything that we've collected in what we now call the Book of the Dead. This would have depended on where you were, how much you could afford, and what copies of things your local temple library, the Perranque, would have had. And so you might not have even known everything that was available, but you knew that you needed certain things, to accomplish a certain purpose, so whatever they had there, and also at what time, because, over the many hundreds of years that, actually really thousands, because we know that parts of the Book of the Dead were being used at the very beginning of the New Kingdom, but were still being used in the Roman period, which would have been well over 1,000 years later. And they mention in here that a copy of the Book of the Dead could easily cost half the average laborer's annual wage. So if you had short pockets, then you might have to just settle with maybe a shabti inscribed with chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead. Because another thing to remember is not all of the spells were carved just on, were written just on papyrus. You had some of them that were made specifically for ushabtis. There's a spell from the Book of the Dead that's inside the back of Tutankhamun's mask. What's also fun about this particular copy of the Book of the Dead and the introductory chapters in it is they point out that there was a great deal of scholarly bias against the Book of the Dead and its related mortuary texts by the same scholars that were trying to study it, because they were coming from a rationalistic and monotheistic background. And that influenced a lot of their early conclusions. This book is kind enough to point out, to assert, however, that the intelligent elite were really monotheists, or to say that the wide variety of gods actually are aspects of a single deity, is merely wishful thinking. We must beware of trying to impose our intellectual frameworks upon the Egyptians. Now, do you remember when I was talking about various pagan books that tried to explain the Egyptian religion as, one godhead with multiple manifestations? They were using these outdated sources that just got invalidated right here. So this is all 100-plus-year-old outdated work. Now, unfortunately, some of that work is still commonly available now, and it was written by one gentleman in particular, Sir A.A. Wallace Budge. Now, a lot of Kemetic reconstructionists look with great disdain on Sir Wallace Budge, because yes, he was knighted in 1920. But apparently he wasn't well liked by his contemporaries either. And his predecessor at the British Museum, a gentleman named Peter Lapaz-Reneuf, anticipated Budge publishing his own copy of the Book of the Dead, around the turn of the century, and he had this to say about it. At a time when bookmaking flourishes as it does, it would not be surprising to hear of the appearance, in either England or America, of a new translation of the Book of the Dead. It is not even necessary that the enterprising author of such a translation should know the Egyptian language. By a judicious blending of the versions of Deroger, Pierret, Devier, Goyes, and others who might be mentioned, a very plausible translation of the Book of the Dead might be composed. The impudent jackdaw of the fable would strut with borrowed plumes. Or, to take the illustration from another fable, the ass would go forth under the cover of the lion's skin and impose upon all who failed to discern the long ears occasionally protruding. Damn, they didn't like this guy. Why? Well, some of that was actually good old-fashioned elitism. Because most Egyptologists at this time were wealthy. Remember, this was at a point before you had, a whole lot of scholarships and financial aid and stuff like that in order to go to college. You had to have money. And some of these Egyptologists were also ordained ministers, which explains some of the religious skew that they had in their thinking. But they looked down on Budge because he was basically the illegitimate son of a single mother. He went on to study Hebrew and Syriac as a youth with a tutor, and then was studying Assyrian on his own, on his lunch breaks at St. Paul's Cathedral. And the organist there noticed, hey, you're studying this on your own time? Wow. And talked to some people and got the money raised for Budge to go to Cambridge University. And so, think of him as the poor kid, who made good on scholarship. And as a matter of fact, at his death, he had established a scholarship that even today supports Egyptologists going to Oxford or Cambridge University. So, before we completely dismiss Sir Budge out of hand, keep in mind that he came from humble beginnings and, made an uphill climb to get where he was. And he was the one that found the Papyrus of Ani, which is what was used for this book. But he also had friends in the occult community, which definitely did not endear him to the academic field at the time. Because, and even today, there are a lot of folks in the Egyptology community that would just as soon take us and hold us at arm's length. So, that was something that, a lot of people in his field looked down on him for, but it made him a lot of friends, and that's probably one of the reasons why he's so eagerly cited by pagan authors even today. But what about his academic work? The two biggest problems that he had with it were, one, he was trying to equate Egyptian beliefs with Judeo-Christian ones, and he had the same colored lenses that everybody else in his day had, but also his own biases at the time, his international biases, you could say, got the better of him. Because you see, in the early 20th century, there were German Egyptologists, most notably Adolf Erman, who developed a system of transliterating the Egyptian language that basically used a consonantal skeleton, which is what that language is. And today, if you read things that are transliterated in a scholarly document, they're probably going to use that system. But these were German Egyptologists putting this together in the early 20th century, around the same time as World War I. And so Sir Wallace Budge, well, he wasn't a knight at that point, but he was a good Brit and didn't want to have anything to do with those German scholars, so he missed out on all of the advancements that they were making in the field of the Egyptian language and studying it and studying the texts and trying to standardize a way of translating it. And instead, Budge had a way of randomly inserting things in vowels into words in ways that, really they don't hold up over time. But you'll see it especially in books, including pagan books, that use his works as a reference, and you can kind of tell because, they stand out because it's like, wait a minute. Alright, they give an example, the phrase to be partial, to incline to one side. And again, I'm just kind of putting, quick sounds in between the letters, but they translate it as, or transliterate it as RDT, hard H, R, guess. Well, Budge made it Urta, her guess. He doesn't have any way of knowing where the vowels, if it was Urta or Redet or something else. But, if you find something like that in a book, okay, they were reading Budge. So, basically, his own, politically motivated biases of the day were preventing him and others who happened to be in the same train of thinking as him from benefiting from advancements, being made elsewhere. In short, nationalism hurts science. Now, what about poor Professor Erman? Well, funny thing, under the Nazis, he lost his position at the university he was a professor at because he was a quarter Jewish. So their prejudice hurts science. Your lesson for the day. Now, if you happen to have some books that Budge put out, the one thing he does do that's very useful is he includes the hieroglyphics and then his own attempt at transliterating it and then translating it underneath. That's really handy to have, but always cross-check it with something else. If you have one of Budge's books open, have another book like Sir Alan Gardner's Egyptian Grammar or Raymond O. Faulkner's Egyptian Dictionary open at the same time so that you can cross-check. So, there's a lot of good things to be learned in this copy of the Book of the Dead, not to mention the fact that you have the actual chapters here. I mean, these things are beautiful color photographs, and again, we were looking at these to see the altars, but there's a whole lot of other things that you can look at and study, especially if you're interested in Egyptian magic, then you might want to learn and understand some of the iconography in some of these chapters. So get it, read it, enjoy it, be better for it. And I will see you back here very soon. So in the meantime, this is Sharon wishing you Senebti.
Enjoyed this video? Then be sure to hit like and subscribe to the Kemetic Independent channel. You can also buy my books on lulu.com and shop for pagan supplies in my Etsy store. Check the description for links. And special thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Join us for updates, outtakes, and exclusive videos only on Patreon.